summer of music like never before. BBC HD.
It's flattering. They think that I could be part of their tribe. I'm not quite sure how I'm going to manage it going forward. I'm glad that I've had this experience to learn what is truly valuable. I feel like I'm part of them now.
The extraordinary journey of self-discovery continues. Tribal Wives, a new series Wednesday at 9 on BBC2. Now BBC2 hands over to the BBC News channel.
I think they should stay in, but I don't think they should risk their lives afterward to try and defend the vote, because I think that will only lead to tremendous bloodshed.
Johan.
Well, Morgan Tsvangirai won the first round, so it's a very difficult situation he's in, because he's effectively, he stays in, he's legitimating this disgusting, they're going into the areas that were swing areas and effectively slaughtering people in an attempt to make them vote ZANU-PF. It's an incredibly difficult situation, but again, we've got to look at where we can realistically apply pressure. The obvious area is South Africa, where Thabo Mbeki has been incredibly depressing. He's really, and actually I have to say...
So you weren't convinced by his visit to Bulawayo to see Mugabe on Wednesday?
No, I mean, actually, although it's not very popular to say, I'm also very disappointed with Nelson Mandela. We're going to all be celebrating his 90th birthday. He has unimpeachable credentials on this, and he has failed to say a word of condemnation from Mugabe. I mean, we've also, to be fair though, have seen the best of South Africa, not among the leaders, but amongst their people. That fantastic decision by the boat workers in Durban to not handle the arms shipment from China to Zimbabwe, that was a really heroic moment. Ordinary South Africans do not support Zimbabwe, and they want their government to not support Mugabe.
But the issue at the moment, can you understand the MDC's dilemma here? Sure. Should they stand or should they withdraw? If they withdraw, Mugabe gets the victory.
Yes, of course, but they're not going to let that happen, because I think they will rely on the South African Development Corporation, the regional group that's going to oversee it, community, to actually do something, and they are talking more and more about it. In fact, even South Africa's own ruling party, their leaders, and I mean Jacob Zuma has been saying that there is less tolerance. Actually, that's a very interesting point about Nelson Mandela. My neck of the woods, India, for years supported the struggle against apartheid, but they have said very little or hardly anything at all about Zimbabwe. And this goes to the heart of the matter: the reluctance to criticize coloured governments that crush their people, while white racist governments will be criticised, ad lib.
It is a form of soft racism, of course.
It is a form of soft racism, and it is important for people to realise that actually, though Zimbabwe was really a model, till the 90s.
All right, well, very, very quickly, when Mugabe says only God will change power in this country, does that mean essentially it's going to be a very, very difficult week ahead?
God moves in mysterious ways.
If you believe in God, that is. But I go back to what I said, Nick. No, I don't think it's going to make. I don't even think Morgan would even be an even better leader than Robert Mugabe.
Oh, I violently disagree with that last point. But well, I could scarcely be worse. But we can pressure the Chinese government as well. They're selling Mugabe arms. The Olympics are coming up. They're very sensitive to international criticism. We've got to look for the points of pressure we have. They're limited. China and South Africa.
All right, well, thank you all very much indeed. We'll be looking at what happens next Friday in Zimbabwe here on Dateline London. From me, Nick Gowing, and all of the guests, thanks very much indeed for joining us. I'm back at the same time next week with Dateline London. Until then, bye-bye.
And that edition of Dateline London, of course, was recorded earlier before the announcement by Morgan Tsvangirai, the leader of the MDC in Zimbabwe, that he has now decided to stand down, in fact. And we'll have more on that coming up in just a few moments in our next bulletin. But first, let's take a check on the weather. Here's Louise Lear.
Hello there. A new working week and a new outlook to the weather. What a surprise. Fine, dry and sunny for today at least. Enjoy it if you can. Some sunny spells and lighter winds around today. Certainly better than that area of low pressure which is drifting off into the continent that we had yesterday, and the gusts of gale force winds across the north of England. So high pressure builds and stays with us, so a good deal of fine, dry weather around. to start the day, and it looks likely to stay like that throughout the day as well. One or two isolated showers into Northern Ireland and the far north of Scotland, but generally speaking fine and dry, and a better day certainly for the north of England, where we had gusts of winds in excess of 60 miles an hour yesterday. So 19 degrees, lengthy spells of sunshine I think for the north, a little more cloud perhaps from time to time through the Midlands and Norfolk, but generally speaking the further south and east you come, we're looking at highs of 22 degrees 72 Fahrenheit, and that continues along the south coast. Cloud will come and go into the southwest, a slim chance of catching a shower, but they really will be very few and far between, and brighter, sunnier skies for much of Wales, with temperatures between 17 and 20 degrees into the afternoon. A few showers likely into Northern Ireland, shouldn't spoil the day too much, but there will be more cloud here and a few showers into the far north of Scotland. But it bodes well for the start of Wimbledon. The weather looks fair, not only for the first 3 days, but perhaps throughout the first week as well. 22 degrees the high, more cloud I think around on Wednesday. Now more rain to come for Tuesday in actual fact. That wet weather pushes into Northern Ireland and gradually into western Scotland. More cloud generally the further west you are. The best of the breaks in the cloud and sunny spells into that southeastern corner. And it looks likely to stay grey and wet to the north on Wednesday and Thursday. Best of the sunshine, central and southern areas.
Get the headlines every 15 minutes here on BBC News.
Morgan Tsvangirai, the leader of Zimbabwe's opposition, pulls out of the presidential election runoff.
We in the MDC have resolved that we will no longer participate in this violent, illegitimate sham of an election process.
He accuses President Robert Mugabe's party of orchestrating a violent campaign and has called on the United Nations to intervene. Survivors found, but hundreds are still missing from a ferry sunk by a typhoon in the Philippines. Oil summit in Saudi Arabia, world leaders call for oil-rich states to act as prices soar. Hello, welcome to BBC News from me, Alistair Yates. International condemnation of Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe has intensified after the opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai decided to pull out of this week's presidential poll. Mr. Tsvangirai said a free and fair vote was not possible in the current climate of violence. The United Nations Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said the decision was a deeply distressing development. The White House called President Mugabe's regime illegitimate and said it would ask the UN Security Council to consider the issue. This report is from our Africa correspondent, Ola Guerin, who's in Johannesburg.
A bitter moment for Morgan Tsvangirai, stepping out of the race with just days to go, saying a free election was impossible.
We in the MDC have resolved that we will no longer participate in this violent, illegitimate sham of an election process. The courageous people of Zimbabwe, of this country, and the people of the MDC have done everything humanly and democratically possible to deliver a new Zimbabwe under a new government.
Only hours before, his supporters couldn't even gather for a rally that was sanctioned by the courts. Thousands of ruling party thugs blockaded the venue and beat some who tried to reach it. There's been no word yet from President Robert Mugabe, last seen at this campaign rally yesterday. But the MDC pull-out plays right into his hands. His ministers claimed today Morgan Tsvangirai withdrew to avoid defeat, but said the runoff would go ahead with or without him.
The people are going to vote, the people will vote him out, whether he is there or not. Why does he make a decision for all those people who want to vote? They are going to take place, we'll go ahead. It's a constitutional mandate. It's not a Tsvangirai run-off election or a British run-off election. This is the Zimbabwe constitution.
Here come the thugs again.
Stay behind the room.
Yeah, stay behind, Jen. Let's stay behind.
The opposition says it's not an election, it's a war, waged by President Mugabe's henchmen against the Zimbabwean people. American diplomats recorded these images of ruling party thugs rampaging through a township, chasing opposition supporters. And this is what's been happening when they catch them. Almost 3,000 people have been beaten or tortured. In the face of this violence, the MDC says it had no choice but to pull out. Many of those who want change in Zimbabwe have paid a high price. More than 80 people have been killed, according to Morgan Tsvangirai. He said today he couldn't ask anyone else to vote for the MDC when that vote could cost them their life. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Johannesburg.
So what does the future now hold for Zimbabwe's opposition movement? The South African president has called for negotiations between Mugabe's party and the MDC. Here's our diplomatic correspondent Brian Hanrahan with his assessment.
Morgan Tsvangirai's withdrawal from the election ends any hope that it's democracy that will produce a solution to Zimbabwe's troubles. But the problems there are now so great, they're threatening all of southern Africa. The group now left in control in Harare, the military leaders surrounding and supporting Robert Mugabe, show no sign of having any political plan to manage Zimbabwe. And with their own survival at stake, they seem in no mood to heed the international disapproval heaped upon them.
I believe we've reached an absolutely critical moment in the drive by the people of Zimbabwe to rid themselves of the tyrannical rule of Robert Mugabe. It's evident that the only people with democratic legitimacy are the opposition, because after all, they won the first round of the parliamentary elections in March and the first round of the presidential elections.
But Zimbabwe's society is on the point of collapse. Hyperinflation, counted in hundreds of thousands of percent, has made the economy unworkable. Starvation has become a real risk for millions of people since agriculture collapsed. And the violence which has disrupted the election could take root in a country which otherwise has remained largely peaceful. The UN is preparing for a new wave of refugees spilling across Zimbabwe's borders and carrying instability with them. The other leaders in the area want something done to contain Zimbabwe's problems.
It's still necessary that the political leadership of Zimbabwe should get together and find a solution to the challenges that face Zimbabwe. So I would hope that that leadership would still be open to a process which would result in them coming to some agreement about what happens to their country.
Now, only Zimbabwe's neighbours can have a direct influence on events there. And until now, President Mbeki has blocked any criticism of Mr. Mugabe. But Southern Africa's leaders are worried that a collapsed state in their midst will harm them all.
Analysis on the Zimbabwe situation there from Brian Hanrahan. Well, the BBC is banned from Zimbabwe, but our correspondent Caroline Hawley is in Johannesburg, and she says the South African government still believes it can have a role to play.
Well, as you know, South Africa has been mediating for quite some time. The mediation efforts, frankly, have not gone very far, but he would very much like, Thabo Mbeki would, to get Robert Mugabe sitting down with Morgan Tsvangirai to discuss some form of government of national unity. But it is very difficult to see what they would have to say to each other. And in fact, I spoke to one MDC official and I said, what do you think of this? And he said, Mbeki can go to hell. So fairly strong words. I think at the moment the opposition is really licking its wounds, and there have been many. They say that they've lost more than 80 of their activists, that thousands of people have been beaten and tortured, tens of thousands displaced. And at the moment, I don't think they're in much mood to negotiate. Robert Mugabe has made very, very clear that he's not going anywhere. You'll remember that he said on Friday that only God could remove him from office. Morgan Tsvangirai, who believes that he should be the president of Zimbabwe, does not want to sit in a government with Robert Mugabe. So it's hard at the moment to see where things are going to go from here, but I'm sure there will be great pressure on the South Africans to try to find some kind of mediated settlement to what everyone here in the region now believes is a deepening crisis.
Well, Dennis Benton is with the Zimbabwe Visual Human Rights Group here in London and says the MDC is in a difficult position.
Opinion is divided on that. The reasons he gives for pulling out of the elections are the fact that it's pretty confident they're going to be rigged, and the onslaught on MDC supporters. On the other hand, people I've spoken to, both in Zimbabwe and in the United Kingdom, have expressed dismay at this decision. They feel that it's handing the presidency back to Mugabe, and that Africa, and indeed the rest of the world, will use this to recognize Mugabe's continuing presidency.
Indeed, we've had many emails into the BBC from people from within Zimbabwe actually saying that they feel rather let down by Morgan Tsvangirai and the MDC. They've been voting for him. Now they're saying that all that they've stood for has been sort of given away.
Yes, people on the ground have been showing great courage and expressed their determination, in spite of this brutal onslaught by ZANU-PF, to turn out on Friday in the hope of voting out Mugabe. The poll might well be rigged, but they feel that at least they need the opportunity to express their anger at Mugabe.
It's a difficult balance, isn't it, in terms of human rights, whether to keep on with this and to face the bloodshed that is going on in Zimbabwe, or to give up, as is clearly what's happened now.
Well, I wouldn't say that the MDC has given up. Tsvangirai is going to make an announcement on Wednesday on his proposals for the future. What he wants is what he calls a government of national healing. This is not the same as is proposed by Mbeki, who wants a transitional government led by Mugabe. This is unacceptable to Tsvangirai, quite understandably, because he clearly won the first round of the elections. He wants to allow some ZANU-PF representation in a transitional authority, but not the chief architects of the present misery.
Well, indeed, we've been getting lots of reaction to the news that the MDC will withdraw from the presidential runoff election from inside Zimbabwe, and here are some of those emails that have been coming into us. Tapondwa in Hwange, first of all, believes it's the best decision ever by Tsvangirai, who's proved that he's concerned for the suffering masses of Zimbabwe. God will judge Mugabe. Mark in Harare wrote to us saying, how can the MDC fight against ZANU while the ZANU party has the guns? The West is allowing ZANU to get away with the crimes against humanity, and the Zimbabweans can do nothing. Also writing from Harare, Tula Zizwa says, yes, the decision was the correct one. No lives should be lost just for an election. If Mugabe wants to rule, let him rule until the day he dies. As far as I'm concerned, he's not the leader of Zimbabwe. Martin in Zimbabwe believes pulling out of the election seems the only logical thing to do. He writes the country is being run by ZANU-PF thugs who are immune to the laws of the country. But Tendai wrote to us disagreeing, saying, I think that the MDC should have gone ahead with the runoff. I believe people were still going to turn up to vote. Pulling out of the election only serves to legitimize the Mugabe regime. Many thanks for those emails, and keep them coming in. You're with BBC News, and still ahead, the French President Nicolas Sarkozy, on his first visit to Israel, says the creation of a Palestinian state is in everyone's interest. Fears of a split in the Anglican Church over the ordination of gay bishops are overshadowing a meeting of conservative bishops in Jerusalem. They're discussing the future of the worldwide Anglican Communion. Many have already said they'll decline an invitation to attend next month's Lambeth Conference as a protest against the issue. From Jerusalem, Robert Pickett reports.
Traditionalist Anglican clergy went back to their roots today, meeting for a service in Jerusalem. They're the harshest critics of the liberal American church and its ordination of an openly gay bishop. So strongly do they feel that they're even discussing what amounts to a blueprint for an alternative Anglican communion. Today there was criticism of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, for allowing the dispute to reach this crisis. A brother Archbishop claimed Dr. Williams had procrastinated and had not always been brave enough to stand up to those who broke the rules.
I think we've been on fire for quite a while, and you just cannot leave us burning and delay. At what time will you salvage us? And I think he has a key to saying something as the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Tomorrow, all 300 bishops, dressed in their robes, will process up to the Mount of Olives with its panoramic view of the old city of Jerusalem. The bishop's dramatic spectacle here in the city where the church was born will be highly symbolic. Their message to the rest of the Anglican Communion will be that they're ready to cut their links with Canterbury if that's what it takes to return to what they say was the original teaching of the church. But the leader of the Anglican Church in Jerusalem says the bishops do not speak for all traditionalists.
We don't agree with what happens in the Episcopal Church, but this doesn't divide us. Unity is at the heart of the gospel of Christ.
But it seems some Anglicans would sacrifice unity for a traditional Christian view of sexuality. Robert Piggott, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Villagers in eastern India claim they're still in desperate need of help following 4 days of severe flooding. 2 million people in the state of West Bengal have been affected by the heavy rains. Thousands of villagers are still stranded, and despite food drops organised by the government, many of the people in the worst hit areas are saying that they've not received any aid at all. These are the headlines for you once again this hour. Zimbabwe's opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai has pulled out of the presidential election runoff as international criticism of the government grows. Mr. Tsvangirai has accused President Robert Mugabe's party of orchestrating a violent campaign against his supporters. He's called on the United Nations to intervene. A total of 32 survivors have now been found from the Philippine ferry which capsized in a typhoon. Many hundreds are still missing though, and local villagers reported finding several bodies among the debris and life jackets that were washed ashore. Coast Guards say the ship, the Princess of the Star, ran aground off Sibuyan Island when its engines failed in heavy seas. Well, I've been speaking to our correspondent Michael Barker, who's in Manila, the capital of the Philippines. I asked him if it was any clearer what had caused the ferry to sink.
Despite the Coast Guard reporting engine trouble, there are some conflicting reports about the problem on board the vessel when it began to list. One surviving crew member has been quoted here in the local media as saying he believes that potentially the cargo may have come loose and may have damaged the hold. That is just come from one surviving crew member, so it's still a bit confusing. But the official word from Coast Guard is that they developed engine trouble and heavy waves that eventually caused the vessel to overturn, and it then drifted ashore and was grounded near Sibuyan Island.
And in terms of the history of the ferry company, what's known about that, Michael?
Well, this ferry company, Sulpicio Lines, has been involved in previous maritime disasters. I understand 3, including one that's accounted or listed as perhaps the worst peacetime sea disaster. That was when the Doña Paz, a ferry, collided with an oil tanker in the central Philippines with the loss of 4,000 lives. But in all instances, this company has been cleared of any criminal liability in any of these cases.
A meeting in Saudi Arabia that brought together ministers from leading oil-producing and importing countries has agreed that soaring oil prices are damaging the world economy. Speaking at the conference, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia said speculators and fuel taxes in consuming countries were responsible for the current high price of oil. Paul Wood reports from Jeddah.
Most of the world's oil exporters are gathered in this room, and the majority are quite happy to see prices at record highs. The Saudis, though, want stability in the market. They've increased production by 200,000 barrels a day, and there may be more to come. King Abdullah also promised $1 billion to a fund to help poor countries hit by spiralling energy costs. That may be a sign that the Saudis think prices will remain at $130 a barrel or more. If so, the king sought to deflect blame.
Dear brothers and sisters, there are several factors behind the unjustified swift rise in oil prices, and they are speculators who play the market out of selfish interests, increased consumption by several developing economies, and additional taxes on oil in several consuming countries. Despite these facts, and even though OPEC has sought to meet demand, we find those who point the finger of blame at OPEC alone.
So I propose that the British Prime Minister Gordon Brown came with a detailed plan to improve the functioning of oil markets. A new deal between producers and consumers, he called it. Mr. Brown also wants Western economies to switch from oil to alternative sources of energy, nuclear, solar and wind power. The OPEC nations would be encouraged to invest in these technologies in Britain and elsewhere.
I propose that Britain and other oil consumers should open our markets to new investment from oil producers, including sovereign wealth funds, in all forms of energy, including renewables and nuclear.
There's been a lot of debate at this summit over whether speculators or market fundamentals are to blame for oil at almost $140 a barrel. There's widespread recognition, though, that one of the things driving prices ever upwards is the huge and increasing demand from countries like India and China. That's not going to change soon. So there are no illusions here that an oil summit in Jeddah on Sunday will mean lower prices at the pumps on Monday. Paul Wood, BBC News in Jeddah.
The French President Nicolas Sarkozy has said the creation of a Palestinian state is in the best interest of Israel. On a state visit to the country, Mr. Sarkozy said an Israeli-Palestinian agreement would allow the two peoples to live side by side in peace and security. He's also expected to meet the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas.
Relations between Israel and France have turned a new page. Nicolas Sarkozy and his wife Carla Bruni were met in Tel Aviv by both the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert and the President Shimon Peres. Such a welcome would have been unimaginable during the administration of the former French President Jacques Chirac, who was perceived as being pro-Arab. Nicolas Sarkozy, on the other hand, is part Jewish and since being elected last year has made it clear that he is an ally of Israel. On this trip, he brought along several ministers, all with the intention of strengthening ties between the two countries and renewing a previously frayed relationship. He'll even be given the honor of addressing the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. At the heart of Mr. Sarkozy's policies on Israel is security. France will not accept putting Israel's security at risk, he says. But every time that France could say to his Israeli friends, go towards peace, France will do what it can to support Israel, because France is simply Israel's friend. During Mr. Sarkozy's trip, he's tackling the Israeli-Palestinian conflict head-on. He said that a Palestinian state is crucial to Israel's stability. His trip comes at a potentially decisive time in Israeli-Palestinian relations. Israel and Hamas have just agreed a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and he's expected to meet the parents of Gilad Shalit, an Israeli soldier who has been held by Hamas since 2006. Corporal Shalit also has French citizenship. Nkemi Fejika, BBC News.
The people of the southern Bolivian region of Tarija have been voting in a referendum designed to distance them from central government and the radical reforms proposed by President Evo Morales. It's the fourth department to hold such a vote, and analysts say there's little doubt that Tarija will vote for a resounding yes to greater autonomy. The government said the referendums were illegal, and most of its supporters boycotted the vote. Our South America correspondent Daniel Schweimer is in Buenos Aires, and a short time ago I asked him what the vote meant for the country.
Well, there's no great surprises here. As you mentioned, the analysts have all said Tarija is going to vote a resounding yes to greater autonomy from La Paz, from the central government, and that does seem to have been the case from the exit polls that we've heard so far. The government supporters, those who were against greater autonomy, simply didn't vote. They boycotted the elections, so therefore we knew it was going to be a resounding yes. That's the case. It's now the fourth department to vote against, to vote for greater autonomy. And all this does, although the government's not going to recognise the vote, is putting increasing pressure on President Evo Morales to at least negotiate with these departments, to listen to their case for greater autonomy. They want to have greater say over how they spend their tax money, about land distribution, running their own police forces. That's the kind of thing that they're asking for. But we are seeing with this vote an increasing division now in Bolivia between the rich eastern side of the country, which has plenty of natural gas and oil, and the much poorer, predominantly indigenous part of western Bolivia. So this is the big problem that we're facing now, greater divisions, and it's all going to come to a head at the beginning of August when the president has put himself forward for a recall vote to say to the people of Bolivia simply, do you want me to stay in office or not? So the people will make the big decision then, and we'll see where these divisions in Bolivia really lie.
A journalist in Macedonia who reported on 3 murders has been arrested on suspicion of carrying out the killings himself. police became suspicious when his newspaper articles included details of the crimes that had not been released by officials. Mark Sanders has the story.
Police in Macedonia became suspicious of Vlado Tanaveski after his reports on a series of murders included information that detectives say only the killer could have known. A police spokesman confirmed that the newspaper reporter, who's 56, was arrested on suspicion of raping and murdering 4 elderly women. He was arrested, say police, after forensic evidence linked the reporter to 2 of the murdered women. He had reported on their disappearance, even interviewing relatives of the victims. The cousin of one of them said, "I can't believe that the man was sitting with us at the table. I gave him photos to publish in his newspaper. Who could have known?" Vlado Tanaveski was arrested at his home in the town of Kičevo, about 120 kilometers from the Macedonian capital, Skopje. The reporter who covered the 4 murders is now at the heart of the story as police continue their investigation. Mark Sanders, BBC News.
China has allowed a group of foreign journalists to visit a Tibetan monastery near the Tibetan capital, Lhasa, where monks held anti-China demonstrations in March, and our correspondent James Reynolds was there.
We've just come to the Sera Monastery in Lhasa on a very brief government-run tour. This monastery is very important because it was from here and from other monasteries on the 10th of March that protests were led by monks, and those protests escalated into what happened on March the 14th with protests by Tibetan civilians as well. So this has been our first time to actually get into the monastery. We've been given a little historical tour. The government has already told us that it has come here, it's sent task forces in to re-educate the monks, to tell them that they have to obey Chinese law, and to tell them that their main thing to do in life is to study religious texts and to be kind and not to engage in any kind of secular problems. We've just spoken to one of the senior monks here. He says that the re-education takes the form of learning about state law. He says that the monks here had nothing to do with the March the 14th protests. One thing is quite interesting, if you just look around here, here's all our press group. We haven't been able to see any of the younger monks. There are 550 monks here in this monastery, but so far we've only seen, I'd say, about 10 or 12 monks, and most of them have been older people.
BBC's James Reynolds there. Our main headlines this hour. Critics around the world of Zimbabwe's leader, Robert Mugabe, have condemned his actions that have led to the opposition leader, Morgan Tsvangirai, pulling out of the presidential runoff election. 32 survivors have been found so far from a Philippine ferry which capsized in a typhoon. Hundreds, though, are still missing, and local villagers reporting finding several bodies among debris and life jackets that have washed ashore. And floods and landslides caused by the typhoon have killed at least 200 people. That's it. That's our world news. I'm Alistair Gates.
Hello there. Well, yesterday's wind and rain, hopefully a thing of the past today. It really was a miserable Sunday, but what a surprise. High pressure bills, and just in time for the working week, we see sunny spells and lighter winds around today. So we've said goodbye to that area of low pressure, moving off to the near continent, the wet and windy weather starting to ease away, and the high pressure builds from the south. So a good deal of fine, dry weather, I think particularly in the southeast for the next few days, but there will be more rain to come. You can see it on the satellite picture moving in from the Atlantic, and that'll bring more wet weather to Northern Ireland and Scotland from Tuesday and into Wednesday. So enjoy the clear skies and the sunshine that we will have pretty much from the word go for many of us today. Cloud will tend to come and go, but nevertheless it'll be a quiet day with lengthy sunny spells. 1 or 2 showers into the far north and the west, and these may well become a little more widespread into the afternoon. But it will certainly be a better day for the north of England, particularly in comparison to yesterday. We had gusts of winds at over 60 miles an hour in the north of England. So clear skies, light winds, and highs of 19 degrees perhaps in the northwest. A little more cloud for a time perhaps through the Midlands and into the north of Norfolk, but generally speaking fine and dry in that southeast corner. 22 degrees the high in London, 22 along the south coast, and despite a little more in the way of cloud through perhaps say Devon and Cornwall, and a slim chance of an isolated shower, a very slim chance, all in all a fine day. Pleasant sunny spells for much of Wales. As I say, Northern Ireland and Scotland may see some showers into the afternoon, and some of these may well string together for a time, but nevertheless they will just confine themselves to Northern Ireland and the far north of Scotland. So it's the start of Wimbledon, and good news for both spectators, players and organisers will be breathing a sigh of relief as the next 3 days dry, warm and sunny, perhaps more cloud building with each day, but nevertheless a good deal of dry, fine weather around. In fact, by Tuesday, the wet weather will start to sweep in, as we saw on that satellite picture, moving towards Northern Ireland and slowly but surely into western Scotland by the end of the day. 15 to 17 the high here, 19 to 21, with the sunny spells continuing in the southeast corner. By Wednesday, I think the rain will slowly slip out of Northern Ireland and sit across the far north of Scotland. And here we could see some heavy pulses for a time. So disappointing 14 degrees perhaps in the far north, 22 in the southeast again, being the high. That's 72 Fahrenheit. Now at the moment, although it's early days, it does look quite promising, I think, for the next few days to come. As I say, the high pressure will stay with us. There'll be a good deal of dry weather coming through. Dry and sunny with rain to the north. Enjoy.
Get the headlines every 15 minutes on BBC News.
There are so many pressing problems in the world today that end up here at the United Nations. So to have a correspondent based here permanently is a huge advantage. You make contacts with the whole range of people in the place, everybody from Secretary General right down to the tea lady. If you're here permanently, people know you, you know them, and that means you can bring greater understanding to the viewer and you can break stories.
BBC News headlines, I'm Alistair Yates. Zimbabwe's opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai has announced he and his MDC party will not be taking part in this week's presidential runoff election against Robert Mugabe. The UN chief, Ban Ki-moon, has called the decision a deeply distressing development and a bad omen for the future. A total of 32 survivors have been found so far from the Philippine ferry which capsized in a typhoon. Hundreds, though, are still missing, and local villagers report finding several bodies among debris and life jackets that have washed ashore. Saudi Arabia says it's ready to pump more oil for the rest of the year to try to bring down record prices. Leading oil producers and importers agreed at a summit meeting that soaring prices are damaging the world economy. The French President Nicolas Sarkozy, who's visiting Israel, says the creation of a Palestinian state is in the best interest of Israel. Those are the headlines. Now, on BBC News, it's time for the Record Europe.
And welcome to the Record Europe from the European Council here in Brussels, where EU leaders have been meeting to decide where next after the Irish no to the Lisbon Treaty. Also this week, MEPs have been meeting in Strasbourg to vote on further opening up of the EU's electricity market. We'll be asking, though, with oil prices rising, whether this will really deliver a better deal for Europe's consumers. But first, a period of reflection for EU leaders meeting here. They've decided to come back in October with a better idea of what to do after the Irish rejection of the Lisbon Treaty. I'll be talking to three people here about the options after a closer look at what's been happening. Arriving in Brussels, Europe's leaders found themselves in a bit of a quandary. Where next for the Lisbon Treaty? Three options have presented themselves after the Irish no vote. Get the Irish to vote again in the hope of a yes, abandon the treaty altogether, or forge ahead with it, but without Ireland. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel had spoken for other leaders in ruling out this two-speed approach, even before the summit started. And in their summit conclusions, the leaders stressed ratification of the Lisbon Treaty by all EU states should continue.
Vsak, ki je podpisal Lizbonsko reformno pogodbo,
Everyone signed the Lisbon Treaty and will do everything to implement it. That goes for the Irish government as well. But nobody can guarantee the conclusion of the ratification process, because it is not just up to government and prime ministers to decide on that. There are different procedures and they have to be respected.
But the Irish problem won't solve itself, and the Irish Prime Minister Brian Cowen was sent back to Dublin to find a solution and return with it in October. There's a very good chance, though, that he won't risk another no vote, and it looks like he has some tough decisions to make this summer.
What I now have to do is take up my responsibility on behalf of the people that I represent and the interests of my own country to see, can I move the situation from where it is to somewhere that will be better for my country? And we'll have to wait and see, can I? Or is it possible? And what conclusions will we draw from that?
Amidst such despondency, a bit of cheer for EU leaders came in the unlikely form of Gordon Brown, as the UK this week added its name to the list of states that have ratified the Lisbon Treaty. But cracks may be opening up on a different front. The Czech Senate has sent the treaty to its constitutional court for revision, and the French president said the leaders this week had met particular difficulty with the Czechs. The Irish might have been the first to vote no, but there's money here on the Czechs being the second.
I'm not going to force anyone to vote against or in favor, but the truth is that if the ratification were to take place now, I wouldn't bet even 100 crowns on the Czech yes.
Following this summit meant late nights and early mornings, yet there seems to be little to show for all this tiring talk from the leaders. For now at least, the tricky decisions have been postponed for months, and the ball is firmly in Ireland's court. Well, joining us here to talk about this at the European Council are three people. We have Gideon Rachman, who's the Foreign Affairs columnist for the Financial Times, long-time Europe correspondent for The Economist magazine. We have Cathy Sinnott, who is an Irish MEP from the Independence and Democracy Group. And we have Graham Watson, who is a British Liberal MEP. Thank you all for joining us here. Gideon, you've been following the mood music here in Brussels. You've followed many, many summits. It must be a pretty uncomfortable experience being a member of the Irish delegation at the moment here.
Yeah, I mean, they're not in the most comfortable situation, although I spoke to a couple of them just recently and they seem reasonably relaxed. I mean, I think their problem is that they can see themselves being manoeuvred, not now, but a few months down the road, into a very difficult situation where the other EU leaders will come back and say, look, we've all ratified, or almost all of us have ratified, now you've got to think again, you've got to have a second referendum. People aren't quite saying that, but it's clear that's where it's heading.
Do you think the Irish Prime Minister would give in to that sort of pressure?
Yeah, I think he will.
What do you think about that, Cathy Sinnott? Do you think Brian Cowen would give in to that sort of pressure?
I think he's going to be pushed into it. I think before he does, though, he will check his polls and see if he has a chance. I think he's not going to chance the second no. And I think if he comes back to the people without substantial changes, and not cosmetic changes, substantial changes, he's going to get a second no. So I think he's going to weigh that up, and I think when he comes back to the next summit, that's what he's going to be reporting on.
So, looking a couple of months ahead, we know the Irish government now has this time to go back and to think about what the options are. What do you see happening in October, Gideon Rachman?
Well, I mean, they've got to give the Irish something. I mean, I think it'll be this old combination of carrot and stick. They'll give the Irish some sort of protocols on saying, okay, you're not going to have tax harmonisation, you're not going to be sucked into some defence alliance you don't want to be in. So there'll be those statements that the Irish can point to, the Irish government can point to and say, look, things have changed. But behind that, there'll be the sort of veiled threat, which is, look, everybody else wants this, you're isolated, you're in trouble if you don't go ahead.
Graham Watson, I'm going to quote something back to you that you said to this programme in December. You said that Europe needs to power ahead, and if people can't deal with that in countries like Ireland, it's their problem. Is that your line today?
Well, I think to some extent it is, in the sense that you have 27 governments, including the Irish government, who are saying we need the changes this treaty brings to give us the legal powers to do the things that people want us to do. For example, tackling climate change, dealing with immigration, tackling internationally organized crime and terrorism. These are things that people fear. They want the European Union to be involved, but they're not prepared to give it the legal powers to do it. And where I disagree with people like Cathy Sinnott is she's saying, well, campaigning against the treaty, this is a bad treaty. But that's an irresponsible way of proceeding in politics if you're not saying what you want instead. And if you compare the Lisbon Treaty to the Nice Treaty, frankly, for Ireland, it's a lot better.
What sort of scope do you think there is for tinkering a bit around the edges, if you like, to make to give the Irish reassurances about particular areas that they were concerned about?
Well, I think there is scope, but the danger is you try to find a legal solution to a political problem. So let's not tinker with the plumbing. Let's get every national government to deal with the fact that they need to go out and remind people why the European Union was set up. They need to explain to people properly how it works and what the role of national governments within it is, because it's a key role. And then they need to go out and win people's support for the changes they want to make the European Union work more effectively.
Cathy Sinnott, can you see that happening?
Well, I'm not sure that's what should happen. You know, there is this sense of we know best for the people. Can't they just behave themselves and accept what we want to do for them? But the basis of democracy is that people do it for themselves. They pick their representatives, and through that ballot box they control the legislation. That's the basis of democracy. That is not what we have in the European Union. And people are just saying no. I mean, it is foolish for us to think that this no wouldn't have been in other countries had there been referendums. It would have been. And so, yes, we want to build this great Europe, but we have to build it with people, not for people. And then say, okay, take your medicine because it's good for you. We have to all be into this project. And it will work then. I want Europe to work. So I want people to be at the centre of it.
Gideon, there is sort of an element of hypocrisy here, really, isn't there? If we look back to the French and the Dutch votes in 2005, the EU's leaders were prepared to go back and sort of try and work out a way to keep them on board, and it doesn't seem to be happening with Ireland.
Yeah, but the way that they found to keep them on board was, I think, fairly dishonest. I think even Graham might agree with that. I mean, what they essentially did was take this document, the Constitution, rewrite it, obfuscate a lot of things in it, take things out, put them in footnotes, put them back, and then say, oh, it's a new thing, we don't have to have a referendum on this because it's a technical treaty, it's the Lisbon Treaty. So basically, I think 11 governments had promised referendums on the Constitution, and 10 of them backed off. The Irish were the only ones who were legally compelled to hold a vote on the Lisbon Treaty, and even they couldn't pass it. So, they've tried a couple of ways to get this thing through, and they fail each time, and perhaps they should draw some sort of lesson from that.
Graham, the Irish, the first to reject this treaty, but there's been a lot of concern here about the Czech Republic as well, hasn't there?
Yes, and I think it is quite possible that it will not be possible to ratify this treaty in the remaining 7 countries. We may well find ourselves in a situation where Ireland is not the only country to reject it, in which case we really need to go back and do the homework and can proceed on the basis of the existing treaties. It can be done. The sky will not fall in. Europe will continue to do the things it's doing, but then really go out and convince the people that we need greater legal powers so that what is being done is not on such a flimsy legal basis. I don't want the American automobile manufacturers challenging in the European Court of Justice the European Union's right to set anti-climate change laws, but it could happen.
Cathy Sinnott, before we came on air, you were telling me you were very upset at the way the Irish government has behaved here. What were your big concerns?
I suppose I wanted them to act like my government. I want them to say, look, the people have spoken. This is what they said. The treaty is now dead because we are in an intergovernmental institution, and that means that every country has a veto, and a country has expressed that veto. They haven't. At the same time, they have said they're going to go back and look. They are going to see about it. And I think the issue is not that we need to go out there and convince people. That's not what the Irish government needs to do, or any other government, or the EU. They need to go out there and see about real structural change that everybody can be happy with and sign up to. I think if we saw real democracy, real democratic structures where people could actually see their power from them all the way to the legislation, I think everybody will vote yes.
Gideon, I mean, how much is this treaty actually needed? Because what people said was it was needed to keep the European Union working after enlargement. But enlargement, the first big wave of enlargement, happened a few years ago now, and some quite big decisions have been made quite efficiently, haven't they?
Absolutely. I sometimes get the impression, talking to European politicians who are backers of this treaty, that they've kind of forgotten why they wanted it in the first place. They just sort of want it because they've been pushing for it for so long. It feels like a defeat just to abandon it. But you're right. The original rationales for this treaty were to do with, making the European Union work better, under enlargement, but as various academic studies have shown, in fact, the EU doesn't seem to be working any worse in the enlarged 27, and some of the other rationales have also disappeared along the way, because when they were writing it as a constitution, the idea was this was going to be a clear, very lucid political statement that everybody could sign up to, but then when the French and Dutch didn't sign up to, they went for something incredibly tortuous and complicated again. So I think they sort of lost sight of why they need it in the first place. They just sort of think, we've got to have it.
Do you think they've lost sight of why they need it, Graham?
No, I don't think they've lost sight of why they need it. Clearly, the Lisbon Treaty does two things. It makes the European Union more democratic and efficient, but it also gives the European Union the power to go out and build a common foreign policy, which means we will be able to stand up to the Americans, for example, where we disagree with them. I believe Europe's people want that, and I hope that governments will go out and make the case for it.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us. Well, maybe not so much happening here in Brussels, but elsewhere, the legislative life of the EU continues. In Strasbourg this week, MEPs approved measures on the further opening up of Europe's electricity markets. The backers of this package hope that it will give consumers in Europe a better deal. The EU's energy markets are already open to competition. Consumers have the right, at least in theory, to choose their electricity and gas suppliers. In practice, though, a single energy market is still far away. Backers of this latest attempt at liberalisation say previous attempts haven't worked, and many consumers are getting a poor deal.
In many countries, consumers are struggling with the operators. So far, liberalisation has come to mean worse quality and higher prices, because governments haven't opened their markets. This situation can be ended by this package. It means that we have true competition in the energy market, and this means that operators can fight for consumers.
The solution proposed by the European Commission and endorsed this week by MEPs is to separate the generation and distribution of electricity, effectively forcing giant energy companies to sell off grids and pipelines. The European Commission says this has to happen to encourage new companies to invest in the market.
This is not just about better prices and more choice. Ensuring security of supply will need massive investments in new networks over the next couple of decades. If we allow the status quo to continue, these investments will just not be made to the extent needed.
MEPs also this week approved a sort of consumer's charter, a list of their rights to help them get the best deal. This includes things like the right to change electricity supplier free of charge and within 2 weeks, compensation for poor service and quality, and some protection against market abuse, allowing regulators to cap prices if they rise too much due to lack of competition. Consumer groups said they were very happy with this week's vote, and pleased too about calls for national governments to look at the issue of fuel poverty, why some people are forced to pay far more than they can afford for their fuel.
We first of all highlight the need for more competition in the market, but also indeed to protect consumers, supplying them with information, allowing them to switch easy, but also to protect consumers. And the European Parliament very much laid emphasis on that. They have included vulnerable consumers and energy poverty in the directive, which was not there, and we're very pleased to see that.
These proposals on splitting the generation and distribution of electricity, unbundling as it's called, have met some pretty stiff opposition though from countries like France and Germany, home to large energy companies. They're suggesting different options, like allowing these companies to hold on to both sides of their businesses, but under much tighter regulation. Energy companies say too there are other ways to encourage investment.
We don't believe that the exact model of separation, unbundling, is the key. There are other very important things to be done, such as the harmonisation of regulation and providing the right regulatory framework with the right incentives so that that investment will take place.
MEPs who support these measures say they'll put Europe's consumers back in control. The European Parliament has now set itself on a collision course with the Council of Ministers, which has adopted a broader range of options. National governments can't ignore the wishes of MEPs here, though. They have an equal say in whether these proposals become a reality. Well, joining us here at the European Parliament in Strasbourg, we have 3 MEPs. We have Ellen Ed Morgan, the British Socialist MEP, who's the author of this report that the Parliament has been voting on this week. We have Jacques Toubon, who is a French centre-right MEP and a member of the Consumer Protection Committee. And we have Mariela Baeva, who's a Bulgarian MEP and part of the Liberal and Democrat group. Elena, if we can start with you. A big vote in favour of your report here at the European Parliament, and you've said this is a great victory for consumers. Does this mean, if it's adopted, that consumers across Europe will see their energy prices fall?
Well, I think people would be very unwise under any model at this point in time when oil is going through the roof to pretend that energy prices are going to fall. That is not likely to happen under any model. But what we were addressing here is how to get the best deal for citizens. What is the best thing for consumers? Can they choose who their supplier is? Can they have rights? We ask member states to tackle the issue of energy poverty, put it onto the agenda, really take it seriously, because with these high energy prices, people are really suffering, and we need to put the consumer right back into the middle of this debate.
Give me a concrete example. If you're somebody watching in Bratislava or in Strasbourg or in Edinburgh, how in a very specific way would you benefit from this?
Well, at the moment, just to give you an example, in the UK, it's very easy to switch supplier. If you think the price is too high, you can look around and you can get a cheaper price, and at a touch of a button, you can switch supplier. Now, about 20% of the population take advantage of that possibility. In France, about 1% of the people do that. And we think that these markets should be opened up so that consumers are really in the driving seat.
Jacques Toubon, we mentioned France there. The French government has been strongly opposed to these plans to separate the generation and the distribution of electricity. Why is that?
Why is that? Because there is not any evidence of the efficiency of the ownership and building that Elena has voted this morning, this week. Not any evidence. It's purely an intellectual, logical, I agree, logical, or ideological statement, And, for instance, in Britain, there were no decrease of the energy or electricity prices, and so I think that what is the main purpose of the European building in this question of the energy market is to help integrate the energy market for the benefit of all the consumers,
Elena, Jacques Toubon's saying that there's no evidence what you're proposing here is actually effective.
Well, let's just look at the market as it is. We are talking here about electricity companies very often owning both the transmission, that's the networks, which are monopolies. Let's not forget, these are monopolies, but they also own the generation. So the question you've got to ask is, what possible incentive is there for that company to encourage new people onto the networks? That is the question. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that when you come off the train, the Eurostar, when you reach Britain, you see a huge sign, and it says EDF, the Électricité de France, providing electricity for millions of Londoners. It's almost impossible to imagine a situation where a British company could do that in France. It is almost impossible. It's an unfair playing field, and more than that, there's been proof of discrimination. It's been proved, and the biggest company in Europe, E.ON, has just been found not to be conforming by the rules, and they've been forced to unbundle, to separate their transmission systems from their generation. So don't say there's no proof. There is absolutely proof.
Let's bring in
Mariela
Baeva.
Let's bring
in Mariela Baeva. Just one moment, Mr. Toubon. Just one moment, Mr. Toubon. Let's bring in Mariela Baeva. Yes, Bulgaria, another national government that's opposed to what Elena has been proposing and what the Parliament has voted in favour of. Why is that? Why is the Bulgarian government against this unbundling, as we call it, the separation of generation and distribution of energy?
Well, you have to ask the Bulgarian government. But from my perspective, I might advise that the third option might be effective and adequate for my country. Because let me give an example. that the electricity company in my country has a long-term investment program for the rehabilitation, modernization, expansion or reinforcement of the grid. And for this purpose, credits were obtained and guaranteed by the state from the European Investment Bank and EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And according to the Bulgarian law, the liabilities could not be transferred to a newly established company.
But, I mean, speaking from experience and having spoken to people in Bulgaria, this is a country where the average wage is very, very low and where energy prices are enormous. They're huge. I mean, surely anything at all that might work in the Bulgarian consumer's favour must be good. Do you not think that these proposals that are before the Parliament, the people have voted in favour of this week in the Parliament, are going to going to be favourable for Bulgarian consumers, bring their prices down maybe?
For certain, but to bring the prices down, it is good to provide the business environment for new entrants to the market. So
it's going to be great. I mean, that's one of the really great things about being in the BBC and working at Radio 1 is that they take the whole idea of getting out there and doing live events and reaching the people very seriously.
This summer is going to be lots of bands, lots of live music, lots of festivals, and hopefully lots of sunshine. I love festivals. They rule. People get a bit mad. They just let themselves go.
Now on BBC2, rugby highlights from round 18 of the Super League.